Imagine being sealed inside a steel tube, 250 feet beneath the surface of the Pacific Ocean, surrounded by darkness, freezing water pressing against every weld and rivet, depth charges exploding so close that the lights shatter, men are thrown off their feet, and the hull groans like it might crack open at any second. Now imagine that the man in command of that tube, that crew, that mission, is not a cautious man. He is not a man who waits. He is not a man who calculates the odds and retreats. He is a man who, when told the odds are impossible, smiles and dives straight toward the enemy. That man was Commander Dudley Walker Morton. That submarine was the USS Wahoo. And what happened in January of 1943 in the Bismarck Sea would become one of the most controversial, most debated, most celebrated, and most haunting episodes in the entire history of submarine warfare. This is not just a story about a ship or a battle. This is a story about what war does to men, what men do in war, and the line, sometimes razor thin, sometimes invisible altogether, between heroism and something darker that history has never quite been able to name. To understand what the USS Wahoo did in January of 1943, you first have to understand what the Pacific War looked like at that moment in history. You have to feel the weight of those early months, the crushing, suffocating weight of defeat after defeat after defeat. Because the America that sent the Wahoo into the Pacific in the winter of 1943 was not the confident, industrial giant of the war's final years. It was a nation in shock. It was a navy still pulling bodies out of the wreckage of Pearl Harbor. It was a military establishment reeling from the fall of the Philippines, the fall of Guam, the fall of Wake Island, the fall of Singapore, the seemingly unstoppable advance of Imperial Japan across an ocean so vast that most Americans had barely glanced at it on a map before December 7, 1941. Submarine warfare in those early months was a disaster. American torpedoes, the Mark 14, were defective. They ran too deep. Their magnetic exploder mechanisms were unreliable. Submarine commanders were firing perfectly aimed shots at enemy ships and watching the torpedoes pass harmlessly underneath or fail to detonate on contact. Men were dying for nothing. Patrols were returning empty. The Navy's leadership, conservative and cautious by institutional tradition, was pulling commanders from their boats for being too aggressive, for taking risks, for not following the doctrine that said American submarines should primarily target warships rather than merchant vessels and supply ships. That doctrine, inherited from a pre-war world that no longer existed, was slowly strangling the American submarine effort. And into this frustrated, bleeding, struggling force came Dudley Morton. He had graduated from the Naval Academy in 1930. He had served on surface ships. He had gone through submarine school. He had served as executive officer, which is the second in command, on the USS Wahoo under Commander Marvin Kennedy before the Navy. In a decision that would echo through history, gave Morton command of the boat himself in December of 1942. Kennedy had been a capable but cautious commander. Morton was something else entirely. Morton was a force of nature. Morton was, by every account from every man who served under him, the most aggressive, the most fearless, and simultaneously the most genuinely beloved commanding officer in the American submarine force. He was a big man, physically, broad-shouldered, thick-necked, with a grin that men described as both infectious and slightly unnerving. He called himself Mush, short for Mush Mouth, a nickname from his academy days. He called his crew his wolves. He believed, fundamentally and without reservation, that the purpose of a submarine was not to hide but to hunt, that the purpose of war was to destroy the enemy's ability to wage it, that every Japanese merchant ship carrying oil, rice, ammunition, and steel was a legitimate and vital military target, and that any American submarine commander who let such a ship pass because he was afraid or cautious or following an outdated doctrine was failing his country and failing his crew. Before Morton took command, the Wahoo had completed 2 patrols. They had been largely uneventful. Kennedy had been cautious. The boat had come back with little to show. When Morton took command in December of 1942, he immediately changed the culture of the boat. He walked through every compartment, talked to every man, asked questions, listened, remembered names and details. He told them they were going to make history. He told them they were going to make the Japanese Navy afraid of the ocean that Japan had claimed as its own. He meant it. Every single word. The executive officer Morton inherited when he took command of the Wahoo was a young officer named Richard Hetherington O'Kane. Dick O'Kane was, like Morton, unusually aggressive, unusually talented, and unusually willing to take the fight directly to the enemy. The partnership that formed between Morton and O'Kane would become legendary. Morton commanded the boat from the conning tower, from the center of the action, relying on O'Kane to handle the periscope observations with a clarity and precision that allowed Morton to focus entirely on the tactical situation, on the big picture, on where the next torpedo was going. They complemented each other perfectly. Morton supplied the aggression and the vision. O'Kane supplied the precision and the technical mastery. Together, they were, in the words of every historian who has studied them, the most dangerous submarine team of the Second World War. The Wahoo's third war patrol, Morton's first as commander, began in late December 1942. The assigned patrol area was the waters around the Carolines and the approaches to Truk, the massive Japanese naval base that served as the headquarters of the Imperial Japanese Navy's combined fleet in the Central Pacific. Getting to Truk was an adventure in itself. The waters around Truk were some of the most heavily patrolled in the entire Pacific. Japanese destroyers and aircraft maintained constant coverage. The approaches were mined. But Morton had received intelligence, imprecise, fragmentary intelligence, as was always the case in those early months of the war, that a Japanese destroyer might be sheltering in the Wewak Harbor on the northern coast of New Guinea. Wewak was not on any American navigational chart that the Wahoo carried. Morton had no detailed maps of the harbor. He had no precise depth soundings. He had no real knowledge of what defenses Wewak might have. He had only a rough idea of its location and the information that there might be a target there. A cautious commander would have ignored it and continued to the assigned patrol area. Morton headed for Wewak. He navigated using a schoolboy's atlas, an actual student atlas that someone on board happened to have, because that was the only chart of the region available. He took the Wahoo into an enemy harbor he had never seen, in waters he had never charted, looking for a target based on fragmentary intelligence, and he found one. What he found was not just a destroyer. What he found was a significant Japanese naval presence. The Wahoo attacked. It was a brutal, chaotic, terrifying engagement. Japanese vessels were everywhere. Depth charges went off so close that men were knocked off their feet. The Wahoo fired multiple torpedoes, scored multiple hits, and managed, somehow, through a combination of Morton's aggression, O'Kane's precision, and the extraordinary skill of every man on that boat, to escape. The destroyer Harrisame was damaged. Other vessels were engaged. The Wahoo slipped out of Wewak Harbor and back into the open sea. Morton sent a message to Pearl Harbor that has become one of the most famous signals in submarine history. It read, in its entirety, "In 10 hours of patient attack, Wahoo has ruled the seas of Wewak." It was theatrical. It was boastful. In the culture of the pre-Morton submarine force, it might have been considered inappropriate. Fleet Admiral Chester Nimitz read it, reportedly smiled, and decided that Morton was exactly the kind of commander the Pacific War needed. But the action at Wewak, dramatic as it was only the prelude. The patrol that would make history, the engagement that would generate debate that continues to this day, the mission that would be written about in books, argued about in naval journals, and remembered with a complex mixture of awe and unease by everyone who studies it, was still ahead. The Wahoo continued its patrol, moving toward its assigned area. And then, in the Bismarck Sea, it found the Convoy. The convoy consisted of multiple Japanese ships. The historical record, assembled painstakingly from Japanese and American sources over the decades since the war, puts the convoy as including the transport bio Maru, among other vessels. These ships were carrying troops and supplies to reinforce Japanese positions in New Guinea. The exact composition of the convoy and the exact number of personnel aboard has been debated by historians for decades, but what is not debated is that the Wahoo attacked. And what is not debated is what happened after the ships began to sink. The attack itself was a masterpiece of submarine warfare. Morton and O'Kane worked together with the precision that had already become their signature. Torpedoes were fired, adjusted, fired again. Ships were hit. Ships began to sink. The Wahoo moved through the convoy like a predator through a panicking herd. Japanese vessels fired back, attempted evasion, attempted counterattack. The Wahoo dodged, maneuvered, persisted. Morton, according to every crew member who later described it, was completely calm. His voice never rose. He gave orders in the same, even tone whether a depth charge had just exploded 50 yards away or the sea was entirely quiet. By the time the attack was over, multiple Japanese ships had been sent to the bottom of the Bismarck Sea. It was, by the standards of submarine warfare in any theater of the Second World War, an extraordinary achievement. But what happened next is what has kept historians and naval scholars debating for 80 years. When Japanese soldiers and sailors began to appear in the water, survivors of the sunken ships, Morton made a decision. The Wahoo surfaced. And then, in what Morton described in his patrol report, and what the crew described in their subsequent accounts, the Wahoo's deck guns and machine guns opened fire on the men in the water. The justification Morton offered, both in his immediate patrol report and in conversations with crew members and fellow officers afterward, was that the men in the water were soldiers, that they were armed, that some of them were firing weapons from the water, that allowing several hundred Japanese combat troops to be rescued and returned to fight in New Guinea was not something he was willing to do, that this was war, and in war, the enemy is the enemy. The debate those actions ignited is one that has never fully subsided. On one side stand those who argue that Morton was correct, that the men in the water were combat troops being transported to a combat zone, that they would have been rescued by Japanese vessels and would have fought and killed American soldiers in New Guinea, that the laws of war as understood and practiced in the Pacific in 1943 were not the laws of war as codified after the conflict, and that Morton was doing what every effective combat commander must sometimes do, making brutal decisions in brutal circumstances. On the other side stand those who argue that men in the water, regardless of their military status, have a recognized right not to be killed while they are helpless and drowning, that even in the context of the brutal Pacific War this action crossed a line, and that the fact that the American Navy chose not to formally investigate or formally condemn it speaks more to the desperation of the early war years than to the moral acceptability of what occurred. The crew themselves, the men who were actually there, the men who operated the guns and watched what happened, have spoken and written about this moment with a remarkable variety of perspectives. Some of them clearly believed, then and later, that it was the right thing to do. Some of them found it deeply troubling and said so in later years. Some of them simply described it as war, as something that happened in war, as something they had to process and then put away because the alternative was to be unable to function. There is no single crew perspective, any more than there is a single historian's verdict. There is only the event itself and the long, complicated shadow it casts. What is not in question is what the Wahoo accomplished during that patrol in terms of sheer military effectiveness. The ships that Morton sank were gone. The supplies they carried were gone. The men who might have reinforced Japanese positions in New Guinea were gone. In the brutal arithmetic of Pacific War logistics, the Wahoo's third patrol was a significant military success. When the Wahoo returned to Pearl Harbor after that patrol, the reception was extraordinary. Morton and his crew were heroes. Nimitz personally greeted them. Morton received the Army Distinguished Service Cross in addition to Navy decorations, one of the very few naval officers to receive an Army decoration, specifically in recognition of the fact that what he had done had helped ground forces fighting in New Guinea. There were celebrations, press coverage within the limits of wartime censorship, and the immediate recognition by the entire submarine force that something had changed, that a new standard had been set, that the kind of war Morton was fighting was the kind of war that was going to win in the Pacific. Dick O'Kane, watching all of this, absorbing it, processing it, was already thinking about the future. He was already thinking about his own command. He was already thinking about what it would mean to take what he had learned from Morton and apply it, his way, with his own instincts and his own approach. The partnership between Morton and O'Kane was one of the great mentor-protege relationships in military history. But like all such relationships, it was a relationship that was preparing both men for separation. O'Kane would eventually get his own command, the USS Tang, and would go on to become the highest-scoring American submarine commander of the entire war. But that is a story for another time. In the immediate aftermath of that third patrol, the Wahoo and Morton were already preparing for more. Morton was not a man who rested. He was not a man who enjoyed the celebrations on shore the way other men did. He was a man who was already thinking about the next patrol, the next convoy, the next opportunity to hurt Japan's ability to wage war. The submarines of the Second World War were not like the submarines of later eras. They were diesel-electric boats, not nuclear vessels. They spent most of their time on the surface because their submerged endurance was limited. They dove when threatened, when attacking under certain conditions, or when approaching targets with extreme caution. On the surface, they were fast enough to intercept almost anything in the merchant fleet. Submerged, they were slower than many surface vessels. The tactical reality of Pacific submarine warfare was therefore almost the opposite of what most people imagine when they picture a submarine. The boats were on the surface more than they were submerged. They were hunters, active hunters, not passive lurkers. Morton understood this instinctively. He pushed the Wahoo hard on the surface, covering vast distances, seeking out shipping lanes, intercepting convoys before the Japanese could reroute them. His approach to radar was aggressive. His approach to torpedo expenditure was aggressive. He believed in overwhelming a target, in firing multiple torpedoes rather than trying to conserve them, in accepting the mathematics of probability rather than gambling everything on a single perfectly aimed shot. This approach, which sometimes earned criticism from more conservative officers who thought Morton wasteful with his torpedoes, was actually a sophisticated and correct response to the deficiencies of American torpedoes at that stage of the war. If your torpedoes don't always work, you fire more of them. The Wahoo went out on a fourth patrol, and then a fifth. Each one produced results. Each one added to Morton's legend. The fourth patrol, in February and March of 1943, was particularly productive. Morton found Japanese shipping in the Yellow Sea, an area where American submarines had rarely operated, and attacked it with characteristic ferocity. He sank multiple ships. He attacked in conditions that other commanders would have found prohibitive. He pushed the Wahoo and its crew to the absolute limit of what was humanly and mechanically possible, and somehow, the boat and the crew responded every time. The fifth patrol brought the Wahoo back to the Pacific and produced more results. Morton's personal charisma was, if anything, growing during this period. His crew would do anything for him. Veterans of the Wahoo who survived the war and lived long enough to give interviews in the 1970s, the 1980s, the 1990s, almost universally described Morton as the greatest commanding officer they ever served under, the man who made them feel capable of anything, the man who made the Wahoo feel invincible. That feeling of invincibility, that absolute confidence in Morton and in themselves, was both the boat's greatest strength and, perhaps, the factor that eventually contributed to what came next. Because the Wahoo was not invincible. No submarine was. The Pacific Ocean was vast and dangerous and full of enemies who were themselves experienced, determined, and increasingly skilled at anti-submarine warfare. The Japanese Navy had learned. The Japanese merchant fleet had adapted. Convoy routing had become more sophisticated. Anti-submarine aircraft coverage had expanded. Japanese destroyers had become more experienced at hunting submarines. The easy kills of the early war months were becoming harder to find. By the autumn of 1943, the strategic situation in the Pacific was changing. American forces were advancing up the Solomon Islands chain. The battles for New Guinea were grinding forward. Guadalcanal had been won, at enormous cost, but won. The industrial might of America was beginning to translate into the equipment, the ships, and the aircraft that would eventually overwhelm Japan's overstretched empire. And in the submarine force, the torpedo problems that had plagued Morton and every other submarine commander since Pearl Harbor were finally beginning to be addressed. The Bureau of Ordnance had been forced, through the accumulated evidence of combat experience and the increasingly angry protests of submarine commanders, to acknowledge that the Mark 14 torpedo had a running depth problem and that the magnetic exploder was unreliable. Corrections were being made. The contact exploder, the simpler, more reliable backup, was being authorized for use. Morton took the Wahoo out on its 6th patrol in August of 1943. It was another aggressive, determined effort. Morton was pushing into areas that other commanders avoided. He was hunting hard. But the patrol was, by the standards Morton himself had set, less productive than the earlier ones. The Japanese had learned. The shipping lanes were being rerouted. Anti-submarine measures were improving. The Wahoo returned from that patrol with results that were solid by any normal standard but which felt, to Morton and to Pearl Harbor, like less than what the Wahoo was capable of. The 7th Patrol, which began in September of 1943, was one of the most audacious plans in the entire history of American submarine warfare. Morton proposed, and received approval for, taking the Wahoo through the La Perouse Strait, the narrow, shallow, heavily patrolled waterway between the Japanese island of Hokkaido and the Russian island of Sakhalin, and into the Sea of Japan itself. The Sea of Japan was, at this point in the war, essentially a Japanese lake. It was the body of water surrounded by the Japanese home islands, the Korean Peninsula, and the Soviet Union. Japanese shipping moved through it in relative safety because no American submarine had ever penetrated it. The Japanese, quite reasonably, did not expect anyone to try. Morton tried. He took the Wahoo through La Perouse Strait in the early days of October 1943, submerged, navigating those dangerous shallow waters in a large submarine, passing through minefields that may or may not have been accurately charted, threading through one of the most difficult submarine passages in the world. And he made it. The Wahoo entered the Sea of Japan and began hunting. What followed was extraordinary even by Morton's standards. The Wahoo found Japanese coastal shipping in waters where no enemy submarine had ever operated. Ship after ship was attacked. The element of surprise was total. Japanese ships were traveling without the zigzag patterns and escorts that had become standard in the open Pacific, because there was no reason to expect a submarine in the Sea of Japan. Morton exploited this. He attacked convoy after convoy, coastal vessel after coastal vessel. He spent days in those waters, hunting, attacking, sinking, and then the Wahoo disappeared. The submarine did not return from its 7th patrol. It never transmitted a message indicating distress. It never reported to Pearl Harbor. It simply stopped communicating. At first, Pearl Harbor assumed it was a communications problem, or that Morton was maintaining radio silence for tactical reasons. But days passed, and then weeks, and the Wahoo did not return, did not report, did not respond to any signal. The Navy waited, as it always waited, as it had to wait, because submarines operated in silence and secrecy, and sometimes communications were genuinely lost for innocent reasons. But eventually, when enough time had passed, the USS Wahoo was listed as overdue and presumed lost. It was October 1943. Dudley Walker Morton, much to everyone who loved him, was gone. Every man on his crew was gone with him. The exact circumstances of the Wahoo's loss were not known until after the war. Japanese records, examined after Japan's surrender in August 1945, and subsequently cross-referenced with American accounts and with physical evidence found much later, established that the Wahoo had been attacked on October 11, 1943, in the La Perouse Strait, while attempting to exit the Sea of Japan after its extraordinary patrol. A Japanese aircraft spotted the submarine on the surface and attacked. A subsequent attack by another aircraft and possibly a surface vessel completed the destruction. The Wahoo sank in relatively shallow water in the strait. The Navy broke the news to Morton's family. His wife was told that he was missing, then that he was presumed dead. His children, who had barely known their father through the years of the war, had now lost him entirely. It was one of thousands of such moments across the American experience of the Second World War, one family's version of a grief that was being replicated in homes across the country and around the world. But it was also the loss of one of the most remarkable naval officers in American history, a man whose career, had he survived, might have taken him to the very highest levels of the Navy's command. In the years after the war, as the full story of the Wahoo's service became available to historians and to the public, the response was complex. Morton was awarded the Navy Cross posthumously and later upgraded to the Medal of Honor. Wait, we need to be precise here. Morton was awarded the Navy Cross. The Medal of Honor was something he was nominated for, but did not ultimately receive, and the debates around that nomination are themselves revealing of the complicated legacy he left. His extraordinary effectiveness as a submarine commander was undeniable. His patrol record, measured in ships sunk and tonnage destroyed, placed him among the top submarine commanders of the war. His influence on the culture and doctrine of American submarine warfare, his demonstration that aggressive, relentless offensive action was both possible and essential, shaped the way the entire submarine force approached its mission. But the events in the Bismarck Sea, the firing on survivors, never entirely went away. In the immediate post-war years, with the horror of Japanese treatment of prisoners of war still raw in public memory, with the violence of the Pacific War still fresh, it was easy to set those events aside, to say that war was war, that Morton had done what needed to be done, that his record of service spoke for itself. As the decades passed and the generation that had fought the war began to age, and as later generations with different reference points began to examine the events of the Pacific War more carefully, the debate became more nuanced. Academic historians, international law scholars, and military ethicists have revisited the Bismarck Sea incident multiple times. The conclusions are not uniform. They are not simple. They do not resolve neatly into hero or monster. What Morton's story actually represents, at its deepest level, is the story of what war does to the categories that peace maintains. In peacetime, the line between a combatant and a helpless person in the water is clear, legally defined, morally understood. In war, especially in total war, especially in the kind of race war that the Pacific conflict became, those lines became blurred, contested, and sometimes deliberately ignored by both sides. Japanese forces committed atrocities against American and Allied prisoners and civilians on a scale that dwarfs anything that occurred on the Wahoo. American forces, from submarine crews to bomber pilots to infantry soldiers, committed acts that would be judged differently in peace than in war. The Pacific War was fought with a ferocity and a racial animosity that has few parallels in modern history, and that context does not excuse anything. But it is essential to understanding how men like Morton made the decisions they made. Dick O'Kane, who was there on that Bismarck Sea patrol, who saw everything that Morton saw and participated in the decisions that were made, went on to command the USS Tang and to become the greatest individual submarine warrior in American naval history. His career, like Morton's, was extraordinary and brief. The Tang was also lost during the war, sunk by one of its own malfunctioning torpedoes in October 1944, almost exactly a year after the Wahoo disappeared. O'Kane survived, was captured by the Japanese, survived Japanese captivity, and was awarded the Medal of Honor after the war. His Medal of Honor citation, one of the most detailed and extraordinary in American military history, describes actions that are in their ferocity and their aggression entirely in the spirit of everything Morton had taught him. The USS Wahoo's wreck was located in relatively recent years by Japanese and American researchers working together, a collaboration that is itself a remarkable footnote to the story of a war that was fought with such hatred and that ended with such a complete reversal of relationships. The wreck lies in the La Parau Strait, in the approximate area where Japanese records indicate the final attack occurred. It has not been salvaged or disturbed. It is, under the Naval Vessels Protection Act and by the quiet agreement of the governments involved, treated as a war grave. The remains of Morton and his crew rest there, in the cold water of the strait, as they have rested since October 1943. The story of the USS Wahoo and the destruction of the Congo Maru convoy is, when you step back from it and look at it in its full context, a story about the nature of war itself. It is a story about courage that is genuine and undeniable. It is a story about skill and leadership and the extraordinary bond that forms between men who face death together. It is a story about aggression and its costs, about what happens when you remove the restraints that civilization places on violence, and tell men that their job is to kill as effectively as possible. It is a story about the specific, peculiar horror of the Pacific War, a conflict that began with a surprise attack and ended with atomic bombs, and that was fought in between with a savagery that challenges comfortable narratives about the greatest generation. Morton himself, had he survived, might have found the debate about his legacy both amusing and infuriating. He was not a man who spent much time questioning himself. He was a man of action, a man who made decisions and lived with them, a man whose greatest pleasure in life was the hunt itself, the cat-and-mouse game of submarine warfare played at the highest possible level with the highest possible stakes. He loved his crew. He was loved by them. He believed in what he was doing. He died doing it. The submarines of the Second World War are sometimes called the silent service, and the phrase is apt in ways beyond the obvious. They operated in silence, below the surface, out of sight of the combat that was visible to the world in newsreel footage and newspaper photographs. Their losses were kept secret for security reasons, and the families of men lost on submarines often waited longer and suffered longer in the specific agony of not knowing. Because the nature of submarine warfare meant that boats simply disappeared without a last radio message, without survivors, without any of the wreckage or witnesses that surface naval battles or air crashes sometimes produced. The men who served on submarines in the Second World War suffered the highest casualty rate of any branch of the American Armed Forces. Roughly 1 in 5 American submariners died during the war. That rate, 20%, exceeds every other service, including the infantry, including the bomber crews who suffered such appalling losses over Europe and Japan. The men knew this. They volunteered anyway. They went out on patrol after patrol knowing that the odds were not in their favor, knowing that the sea did not forgive mistakes, knowing that if something went wrong there would be no rescue, no surrender, no parachute, no life raft. They went out because they believed in what they were doing, because they trusted their commanders, because the alternative to fighting was the alternative they found unacceptable. Mush Morton was their exemplar. He was what they aspired to be. He was fearless in a way that was not the absence of fear, but the mastery of it. The ability to take fear and convert it into focus to turn the adrenaline of danger into the clarity of action. Every man who served under him said the same thing in different words, that when Morton was in command, you believed you could not lose. That is a rare quality in a human being, and it is perhaps the rarest and most valuable quality in a military commander. Napoleon called it, in his generals, the ability to inspire trust. It is not courage alone, and it is not skill alone, and it is not charisma alone, though it contains elements of all three. It is something more fundamental, a quality of presence, of certainty, that transmits itself to the people around you and makes them more than they would otherwise be. The Wahoo's record, by the cold numbers, was this: 7 war patrols, starting from the boat's commissioning, the first 2 under Kennedy, the last 5 under Morton. Under Morton, the Wahoo was credited with sinking between 9 and 20 ships, depending on the source and the methodology of the accounting. The discrepancy in those numbers reflects the general difficulty of confirming submarine sinkings in any theater of the Second World War. Both Allied and Japanese submarines tended to overclaim, because assessing the results of a torpedo attack from periscope depth, hearing explosions, watching through the scope for a limited time, and then diving to avoid counterattack was not a precise science. Post-war analysis using Japanese records consistently produced lower numbers than wartime claims for almost every submarine, American and otherwise. But even by the most conservative post-war accounting, Morton's record was extraordinary. The Japanese shipping that American submarines destroyed during the Second World War was, arguably, the decisive factor in Japan's defeat. Japan was an island nation almost entirely dependent on imported raw materials, oil, food, and industrial inputs. Its ability to wage war was entirely dependent on its ability to ship those materials from the conquered territories of the Greater East Asia Co-Prosperity Sphere to the home islands and to the fighting fronts. American submarines, slowly at first, and then with accelerating effectiveness as the torpedo problems were solved and as the doctrine evolved toward the kind of aggressive convoy warfare that Morton had pioneered, strangled that supply chain. By 1944, Japanese merchant shipping losses were catastrophic. By 1945, Japan was running out of oil, running out of food, running out of everything. The blockade enforced by American submarines was a siege, a slow and remorseless destruction of Japan's economic capacity to continue the war. Morton did not live to see that result. He did not live to see Japan surrender on the deck of the USS Missouri on September 2, 1945. He did not live to see the post-war investigations that confirmed what he had always believed, that the war against Japanese merchant shipping was the decisive campaign of the Pacific War. But his contribution to that campaign, both through the ships he personally sank and through the example he set and the doctrine he helped establish, was real and significant and lasting. The USS Wahoo was, in its brief active career, one of the most effective weapons in the American arsenal. It was also a community of men, a floating village of roughly 80 officers and enlisted sailors who ate together, slept together, fought together, and in the end died together. Their individual stories, the stories of the men whose names appear on the Wahoo's crew rolls from its 7th and final patrol, are largely unknown to the general public. The names are there in the Navy records, in the memorial documents, in the historical archives. They are not famous. They are not celebrated individually. They went to the bottom of the La Parau straight together, and they rest there together still. This is how history works. The commanders get the biographies and the movie adaptations. The crew members get a line on a memorial wall. That is a kind of injustice, but it is also, in a sense, an accurate reflection of how hierarchical organizations like navies actually function. The decisions that determine the Wahoo's fate were Morton's decisions. The achievements that made the Wahoo famous were achieved through his direction. The credit and the culpability flow upward to the man in command, because that is how command works, and Morton, above all else, understood command. The broader naval context of the Wahoo's story is worth staying with for a moment, because the story of individual submarines does not exist in isolation. The American submarine campaign in the Pacific was fought by approximately 16,000 men in approximately 280 submarines over the course of nearly 4 years. Those men sank more than 1,400 Japanese merchant vessels, totaling well over 5 million tons of shipping. They sank hundreds of Japanese naval vessels, including 8 aircraft carriers, a number that, when you consider how central aircraft carriers were to Japanese naval strategy, represents a staggering contribution to the Allied victory. They laid mines, landed and recovered agents and special operations forces, rescued downed aviators, performed photographic reconnaissance, and performed every other task that a versatile, stealthy, long-range platform could be asked to perform. 52 American submarines were lost during the war. Roughly 3,500 American submariners died. Their memorial, the Submarine Memorial in Groton, Connecticut, lists the boats and the men. It is not a famous memorial in the way that the Vietnam Wall or the World War II Memorial on the National Mall are famous. The silent service was silent in peace as it was in war. The submariners did not march in the big parades. Their story was classified, or partially classified, for years after the war ended. The full operational history of American submarine operations in the Second World War was not publicly available until the 1980s and even the 1990s in some of its details. And within that history, the story of the Wahoo and of Mush Morton occupies a special place. Not because it is the most heroic, though it has heroic elements. Not because it is the most productive, though the Wahoo's record is remarkable, but because it captures, in a single boat and a single commander and a handful of patrols, all of the contradictions and all of the terrible clarity of what submarine warfare in the Pacific actually was. It was effective and it was brutal, and it was necessary by the logic of the war that had been begun, and the men who fought it were neither the sanitized heroes of wartime propaganda nor the monsters of revisionist condemnation, but something more human than either. Men of extraordinary ability and extraordinary courage operating under extraordinary pressure in extraordinary circumstances, making decisions that no one should ever have to make, and living or dying with the consequences. The Congo Maru, the ship specifically named in the story of that Bismarck Sea convoy, was a Japanese transport. It was part of the convoy that Morton attacked. The name itself, Congo Maru, is the kind of name that appears in operational records and patrol reports and then disappears from public memory, absorbed into the statistics of the maritime war. The ship was real. The men aboard it were real. The violence that ended their voyage was real. These are the things that history has to hold together. The military effectiveness and the human cost, the necessity and the horror, the achievement and the price paid by everyone involved, victors and vanquished alike. In the decades since the end of the Second World War, Japan and the United States have built one of the most successful bilateral partnerships in modern international history. The nations that fought with such ferocity in the Pacific are now close allies, trading partners, and friends. Japanese tourists visit Pearl Harbor. American tourists visit Hiroshima. The men who fought each other are nearly all gone now, as the last veterans of the Second World War reach the end of their lives. And what remains is the history, in all its complexity and its tragedy and its occasional glory. The story of the USS Wahoo does not resolve into a comfortable lesson. It does not teach us that war is heroic, though heroism occurred. It does not teach us that war is simple, though some of the decisions made in it were made with terrible simplicity. It teaches us, if it teaches anything, that human beings in extreme circumstances are capable of both the extraordinary and the terrible, often simultaneously, often in the same action, often in the same person. Mush Morton was a great naval commander. He was also a man who made decisions in wartime that are not easy to defend in peacetime. He was loved by his crew and feared by his enemies. He was aggressive and effective and, in the end, mortal, like all the men he served with and fought against. He rests now in the La Perouse Strait, in the wreck of the boat that was the instrument of his greatness and the site of his death, in water that is cold and dark and absolutely indifferent to the fame or the controversy or the complicated legacy that his name carries above the surface. The USS Wahoo, SS 238, commissioned at Mare Island Naval Shipyard, California, on May 15, 1942, lost in action in the La Perouse Strait on or about October 11, 1943. 17 months of service, 7 war patrols, the stuff of legend and of grief and of everything that lies between. We study these stories because they are true, because they happened, because the world we live in was shaped by them, by the decisions made in those steel tubes beneath those dark waters, by the men who made those decisions and the men who carried them out and the men who died as a result of them, on both sides of the conflict. In ships and in the water and in the deep ocean were the Wahoo and 51 other American submarines, and all the Japanese ships and all the Japanese crews and all the human cargo of those voyages went, and where they have remained for 80 years, beyond all argument, beyond all praise, beyond all blame, in the final silence that all the noise of war eventually reaches. That is the story of the USS Wahoo. That is the story of Mush Morton. That is the story of the Kongo Maru and the Bismarck Sea and the La Perouse Strait and the Sea of Japan and the diesel smoke and the torpedo wakes and the depth charges and the dark water closing over everything. It is one of the great stories of the Second World War. It is a story that the Pacific Ocean has carried in its depths for 8 decades. And it is a story that, as long as there are people who care about what human beings are capable of, in war and in peace and in all the dark water in between, will continue to be told. Now, here is the question that I want you to sit with after everything you have just heard. Knowing everything you now know about Dudley Morton, about the Wahoo, about the Bismarck Sea, about the decisions that were made and the men who made them and the context in which they were made, do you believe that the line between heroism and war crime is fixed and absolute? Or do you believe that it moves, that it is defined by context and circumstance and necessity? And if it moves, who gets to decide where it is? Think about that. Leave your answer below. Because this is not a question with a clean answer, and the fact that it does not have a clean answer is precisely what makes it worth asking. If this story reached something in you, if it made you think or feel something or question something you thought you understood, then do one thing. Share it with someone who loves history, with someone who needs to hear it, with someone who thinks they already know everything about the Second World War. Because history is not what happened. History is the conversation we keep having about what happened. Keep that conversation going.